Hello, everybody. Welcome to this video podcast, or if you are on audio, the ordinary podcast. I have with me Gina Balarin, who is the author of The Secret Army: Leadership, Marketing, and the Power of People. I'm very excited to have her on our show today. This is one of the conference-related podcasts from Omnichannel X. If this is your first podcast, you should definitely check out our stream, check out some of the others, and check out the website to find out about our conferences and other events. So, Gina, welcome. Please, I've already had a chance to have a little chat with you, but please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. So Gina Balarin, Gina Ballerina to my friends. I am a content marketer by profession, but I'm a storyteller by passion. So I run a company called Verbalistics, verbal plus ballistics, making your words go mental. And effectively, what I do is I work with corporate B2B companies, predominantly in the software space, to be able to help them tell their customers' stories better as part of their marketing. So my background is as a content marketer, also as a marketing director. So I've been in the position of the shoes of a lot of the marketers who are struggling with not having enough evidence to be able to really make software tangible. Because if fundamentally, you don't get those little boxes of software that you used to back in the day where you'd actually buy a physical disk and install it. So how do you make something intangible actually real? Obviously, people use their websites, but everyone knows that's marketing spin, right? But there is an element of authenticity, of truth, that customers can bring to marketing. And yes, of course, everyone knows that marketers select the parts that are relevant. But the really powerful stories are those that actually include elements of dissatisfaction, or, we were unhappy, but now we're even happier because of the way they fixed the problems or the things that made it great. And that is effectively what I do, is I help build those stories from people if they don't have them, by talking directly to their customers, or even inspiring their customers to tell those stories by speaking at their events, and then making them really excited about what they've done and sharing the stories of other customers like them to kind of pull them in and attract them and help them engage with that company in a, oh yeah, that guy told a great story, I want to tell mine too, kind of Me Too way, not in the other Me Too kind of way.
So that is dear to our hearts, because I think it speaks to the organization brand relationship. And it's a humanizing perspective, which is very important to us. We're talking a lot about at OmniX about how does a brand, especially a B2B brand, which can be very large, cold thing.
And nebulous.
Yeah, faceless, contactless things. How can you make that a bit more human? How can you make those human connections, which are required throughout the cycle? There's the pre-sale cycle,
absolutely.
But a customer story is inherently post-sale, and that's very important. I feel, because it's those stories, it's the post-sales experience that the pre-sales customer is really buying.
Definitely.
I think in marketing and sales, we focus a lot on that. How do we get to the purchase order bits? But that it's when you as I say, it's you get what you measure. If we're measuring for that bit, when it's actually the bit afterwards, which is going to make our brand for the long term, that there's a danger in that.
Well, part of the challenges I've come across is that I like working with customers who have happy customers. And when they don't have happy customers, you can't find those stories because the customers simply don't have the end of journey story that you can use at the beginning of the journey. And that means that actually the answer to good marketing, certainly from the perspective of telling good stories, is actually having excellent customer service across the entire buyer's journey. And that way, if you've got that consistency, people know what to expect that they're going to buy. They get what they're going to buy. They get that what they've bought delivered, which is not always the case, especially in software. And then they get their problems solved around the stuff that they were expecting to be delivered. And then they're happy and they'll tell that story. And then that story then goes back to the beginning so that you can encourage other people to do the same. But in that process, so often there is massive disconnect opportunity throughout any stage of that journey. And I think that marketing now is far further down the funnel than it ever was in the past, but it's going to go even further. It's going to go right out the bottom of the funnel and back up again, because if we want to tell good marketing, we have to be in the meetings with the customer representatives. We have to be in the meetings with the people who are solving problems on the phone. We have to be in the meetings with the people who are actually building the software and who are finding out what their users really want to do next, because only then can marketing actually build that seamless journey from beginning to end and back up again.
It's like we were born in the same pod. You're definitely, I think philosophically, it's couldn't agree more. You're talking a lot about the understanding piece, about how marketers have to go beyond marketing, and that's what I think for Omnichannel, we slant towards marketing, and you're a marketing expert, but it is about bringing together those people. How does marketing interface with product development, with service, with technical documentation, with the whole rest of the organization, so that the user is having the right experience? And I think the way that I first heard of you actually was through your excellent article, "How to Stop Creating Content That Disappoints Your Audience," on the Content Marketing Institute, which we've both spoken at their events. And personas are a topic dear to my heart. I want to hear a little bit about that from you, because they're essential to that understanding piece, which you're just talking about. But there's a bit of a debate right now. So, because there's the whole personas versus personalization debate, like data-driven individual personalization. The personas are a kind of an antiquated way of grouping together customers inappropriately, and we should be micro-tailoring to every individual. Can you tell us a little bit of where you stand on that whole thing?
So thank you for having a copy of my book, because there's a chapter in there about personas, which is actually my frustration with people creating personas that are essentially caricatures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we all know that you've got to get to know someone by assuming that they're a certain way, and then you build a real relationship with them. You realize that, just because they're this gender or this ethnicity doesn't actually mean that they behave like that. It's a useful starting point, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not actually going to help you understand who they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's a similar thing with personas. And it really depends how marketers use it. If you've built a persona, let's say CFO Greg, he has 2.5 kids, he lives in a house of X value in this suburb, and he travels to work from time A to time B, and he, runs an organization with this many employees, this business size, this budget. Do you know who Greg is? Do you know what Greg wants? Do you even know that his name is Greg? His name might be Sharon or Susan. And the whole point is that caricatures, if you're focusing on what you're talking to your audience and you have your audience's desires in mind when you're creating a piece of content, that's a good thing. So from that perspective, you've put some thought into who is Greg or Susan and what do they want and how can we give them what they want. That's not a bad thing. So in that perspective, if marketers are actually getting more insight about their prospective customers, that's great. But the problem is that most activities around personalization are very different from the personas. And that's the challenge. So in content marketing, when you're creating a piece of content to speak to a specific audience,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to find those subtle nuances and balances. And what ends up happening is that you just create multiple versions of the same thing. And there isn't really the time to be able to tailor everything exactly for 15 different people.
Mm-hmm.
So personas are helpful in that they help you, put some information in the right place. But what is really fascinating is the concept of what actually underpins their desire to succeed. And often that is a human innate thing. I am a leader, therefore my purpose is to either meet the targets of the organization and deliver the results, or I'm a human-centric leader, and my focus is actually to build the relationships that my people have with my customers, or to improve their own leadership ability, or to get them to take new initiatives, etc., etc. Now, ironically, Fred or Susan or Bob would have the same persona, but completely different perspectives. Because Susan might be trying to build her organization through her people, or she might be trying to build her organization just to meet those financial objectives. Unless you know what purposes your business is actually serving, what problems you're actually solving for Bob or Susan, you might as well not bother creating content that has any personas at all, because they're
Okay.
going to see straight through it and they're going to go, well, you're targeting me, but you actually don't know me
Mm-hmm.
at all. So
So what
stop
I'm
trying to talk to me because you're just giving me noise.
so what I'm hearing is that the kind of the demographic profile information, which we so often see in personas, um, age, sex, location, job role, um, channels, etc. That is just some background context, but it's actually the human motivation bit. That if you don't get the personal motivation and the personal interest of the persona, then the persona is actually lacking any real value.
Absolutely. But it's much more challenging than it looks on paper.
You
One of the
mentioned the word,
most,
sorry, you mentioned the word psychographic.
yes.
Please help us.
Okay.
Lesser mortals.
So I did a project, which unfortunately I left the organization before it came to completion, with a
Hmm.
research agency that was completely different. They weren't looking at the demographic variables, they were looking
Hmm.
at what was going on in the heads of their audiences.
Oh, great.
And they
Okay.
actually did in-depth research with our target audience, who happened to be CFOs at the time,
Uh-huh.
to really ask about what were their motivators, what were their drivers,
Mm,
what was success for them, etc. And
mm-hmm.
although I didn't get to see that research all the way through, I did something very similar when I was writing a piece of content. I think it was called CFO's Definitions for Success or something. It was back in 2014 or 2015, I can't remember exactly. But what we did by just randomly picking a selection of CFOs who happened to be the kind of target audience that might have been buying our software
Mm-hmm.
and interviewing them, much like we're doing today, is we were able to pull together a document with similar themes, similar questions. What do you see as success for the next decade? How does success work for your team? And weave those subtly different perspectives together in a way that made you really go, okay. So we see that those CFOs who are really focused on driving innovation
Mm-hmm.
have these specific drivers in mind. This is what they believe is going to actually help success with their organization. We have those people who are dealing with laggards in the software world who aren't up to speed yet. Well, this is how they're focusing on adopting technology in their organizations. And so
Mm,
maybe there's room for companies to actually focus, get super focused on their audience and identify triggers that show them for who they are inside rather than who they are outside.
mm.
I
Okay.
don't believe that even with the best technology that we have those triggers yet,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when it comes to CFOs, because they don't really like to tell people much about themselves online.
Yeah.
And that's partly why the really in-depth research of understanding your customers, of having actual conversations with
Yes.
your customers,
Yes.
helps build that positive feedback loop that
Yes.
then helps marketers. And coincidentally, at the same time, it also helps the rest of the organization because they know that marketing is genuinely interested in what they're doing. And as a result, it's going to make their life easier when someone actually buys the product because then they're getting what they expected.
I love that. I think that's the point. For me, I fall on the same side of this, and as much as we talk a lot about at the Omnichannel X about the importance of data, the importance of being data driven, data informed, that does not replace
Mm,
human interaction
mm.
and research, because you can't query those kind of things out of the data. You cannot get a data scientist to give you those kind of insights today, at least, and no matter how much AI you throw at it.
Well, what's interesting about that, if I may interject for a
Sure, sure,
second,
sure.
is the
Of course.
difference between um, data that is qualitative and quantitative.
Okay.
So for my own research, when I was doing a master's degree, I did a combination of both, which is quite
Hmm.
unusual because usually people tend to fall into either the qualitative or the
Hmm.
quantitative. Do you want
Hmm.
numbers to prove your stuff, or do you actually want quality, human words talking about their feelings and blah, blah,
Hmm.
blah, which a
Hmm.
data person will go yakety schmack. But the interesting thing is the intersection between those two. And what I did is I used the quantitative data to be able to go, here's where the outliers are, or here's where the commonalities are. Let me drill down to that in more detail. And then interviewed the people who gave thorough, in-depth responses to those qualitative questions, which brought out the whole color behind everything. And so that combination of, this is what the data tells us, but can we actually validate that data with real human experience? Or, as in the case with, I'm a little bit concerned about the future, are we getting data that we expect to see because we're looking at the wrong things?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's such a good point, that the human interaction is where you can go, oh, we're not even capturing that data point. There's a
Exactly.
giant blind spot in our data, which is very, very easy. And if you're relying completely on data, very, very dangerous at scale.
But let's not underestimate the value of a true data scientist,
Oh,
someone who
of
can
course.
look at random facts and stats and graphs that I, as a naturally qualitative researcher, would look at that and go, whoa, dude, I don't know how you see that. I had this
Yeah.
absolute pleasure of working with a true data scientist a few years ago. And we were looking at actually HubSpot marketing data. And you could look, wait, hang on, there's a trend there. Where does that come from? What were you doing at that time? And you go, and I can say, yes, that's what I think we was doing. He said, yeah, okay, but that would explain this trend and this trend, but it doesn't explain the whole trend here. What I'm seeing is ABC. And that's when, as a marketer, I can go, oh my word, that is true depth of insight. So a lot of the companies that I'm working for at the moment are talking about analytics, they're talking about business intelligence, they're talking about reporting, they're even talking about robotic in RPA and automation and all of those three-letter acronyms. But the important thing that underlies all of that is, if you have vast quantities of data, that data has to be analyzable somehow. And then what do you do with that analysis? I mean, there's a data pyramid. I'm sure you can explain this better than I can as a more of a data person. But the point is that you go from just numbers to true insight. And that's not something that a machine can do for you necessarily, or not yet anyway.
Yes, I think, coming, that's the story that we want to tell, is that it's not any one role. It's not that our role as marketers, or our role as UX people, or our role as systems and data science people is the role to listen to. And that's, I think, what we keep coming back to, is that all the new hot stuff like AI and big data and analytics and so on, they are new. They are new paints in our bucket, but they are not replacements for. They are additional to. Very rarely does a tried and true technique simply drop off in importance. Channels drop off, like fax is a dead channel, but the techniques of understanding and reaching out to people, those things that we've been doing as businesses for centuries, I think they're still there, and it's a question of how all these things play together in concert. I think that's
Well,
the omnichannel method.
raises 2 points there. The first one is faxes, believe it or not, are not dead. I still work with
Fax is not dead.
organizations in
Oh, okay.
invoice automation, and honest to God, they still send each other fax documents. I'm still like, what? Seriously? Nope, but it happens, believe it or not.
Okay.
The second point that raises is a question. It's not something we have an answer to, but it's an interesting thing to cogitate about, which is, if people are naturally data inclined, and there have always been parts of the population that can look at information and see almost behind it, maybe they're just curious enough to ask the right questions about it. Are we just giving them more tools to be able to do that? Or is there a possibility that we're actually getting to a point where the tools themselves become noise? There's too much information. They're from different sources. We don't know how to reconcile stuff. Even 10 years ago, when I was working with different marketing automation systems, we were getting different versions of the truth. And so people in different parts of the organization would argue for whichever one made their numbers look better. It's human nature.
Yes. That's come up with a lot of, well, speaking as a consultant now rather than as Omnichannel X, it's come up a few times where the problems have been that we have people silos, and then but with those people
Mm,
silos come
mm,
data and system silos,
mm,
and so many clients are talking about data lakes. We want to throw all our data in a big pile, but it comes back to that thing is that the business wants to be able to know what it's doing. It cannot
mm,
see the extent of itself, and it cannot reconcile its knowledge together. And that's a whole art form in and of itself. And I think some people will just give a simplistic answer. You throw it all in a lake and give it to the right data scientist. And I think, as we've been discussing, there's a more mixed answer. There has to be some rethinking on all the touch points to try to
mm.
do some pre-alignment, so that when you throw it together, it can give you better insights. But I want to get specifically back to our first conversation before this one, um, where we're talking about this coming together and the omni-channel thing, and how do you get centralized understanding, and you highlighted right off the bat that, I throw the word omni-channel around all the time, obviously, but it can mean different things to different people, and that is a source of concern. It is in terminology generally in our in industry is a communication barrier. So can you give me a little bit of insight on what you've heard, what other alternative definitions you've heard of omnichannel, and what you think it means? We have our definition on the website, but what do you think it means, and what have you heard other people that gave you a little bit of pause when I use the term?
So when you said to me, "Oh, I've got this amazing event called Omnichannel X," I'm like, "Why? Huh? Why do you want a marketer to talk at Omnichannel? That doesn't make any sense to me." And the reason is partly because of some bias of some work I've been doing recently with customers.
Hmm.
So they provide customer experience solutions,
Hmm.
which basically means when someone comes into a store or they need an appointment with someone, how do they actually manage the customer's expectation? So this
Mm.
could be booking a meeting room online. It could be making a phone call. It could be sending a text message to someone. It could be having a video interaction with someone. It could be actually having a face-to-face meeting. So my understanding was these are all different channels.
Hmm.
Therefore, if you were talking about omni-channel, I'm like, well, are you talking about how you're going to text me or how you're going to phone me? I don't really get it.
Mm.
And then I realized, of course, that in a marketing context, omni-channel is which of the tools are you using? Which of the channels are you using to reach your target audience? So are you
Hmm.
using social media? Are you using LinkedIn? Are you using email? Are you doing online advertising? Are you doing offline advertising? Are you doing TV, radio,
All of the above.
website, all of that? So those are all different channels.
Hmm.
But the bias effect meant that I was thinking first and foremost about my customer who happens to use an omni-channel approach to the customer experience. But that's not what I understand that you meant by omni-channel, because as far as I understand, omni-channel is, yeah, it's marketing and it's all the different channels that marketers use,
Hmm.
but it's actually all the different channels that organizations use in a technology perspective as well. So tell me a little bit more about how you define omni-channel and why marketing's a part of that.
Okay, so our official definition, which we have on the site, is omnichannel is the unification of engagement and communication strategies so that they complement each other rather than run in parallel to give the audience what they really need. That means experience orchestration across multiple touch points and aligning content design, governance, and systems around the customer's journey. So it's a very customer-centric perspective, and it takes those four pillars: content, design, governance, and systems, and says how can we all come together as various departments and job roles around that.
So effectively, I wasn't too far away in either of those definitions,
Hmm.
but it looks like you're taking a much broader view of things, which is,
Hmm.
yes, there are a lot of channels to reach your customer, but there's also lots of channels that you need to be to listen from your customer. And ultimately, it's about the whole experience across an entire organization. So it's a very
Yes.
macro, high level view, which effectively is where the whole customer experience comes from.
Well, customer
If
experience
you are a
itself is a funny
customer,
term.
exactly. If you are a customer, you have an experience of that brand. Every single touch point interaction you have with that brand, whether it's the advertising that you see or the person who responds on the phone when you call them, or the bot that you see in the bottom right
Mm-hmm.
corner when you're trying to get a question answered, but not that one. And can I speak to a human, please? Well, maybe that's just me, but
Yeah. I know what
So
you mean.
yeah, so omni-channel kind of logically makes sense, but the problem is because it's the terminology that's almost been adopted by a whole bunch of different sectors,
Mm-hmm.
they will each use that definition to serve their own aims and in their own interpretation of how they serve their customers.
Yeah, I think when you started talking, it pinged to mind that immediately that I think the customer experience has that same problem. Not as badly
Yeah.
maybe as omnichannel maybe, but I there's a lot of people who think that or believe that I shouldn't their perspective is that customer experience means the transactional buying experience,
Ah.
which is what I'm getting, which is what I got from what you're saying. So what they mean is, as I am going through the operations and machinations of giving you money and exchanging it for product or service, what is that like? So for me, it's an extremely narrow definition of what the customer
Mm.
experience is.
Yes, that's true.
So and so when you there are the people who specialize in that, you know, de dekinking and degreasing the money trough, so that it feeds the business efficiently, so that you have a frictionless path to in the buying process, and that's fine. I have the same issue when people say customer journey maps, which are dear to my heart. A lot of people mean the buying process or the sales
Yeah.
funnel. And I'm going,
Yeah,
well, no,
exactly.
customers go on all sorts of journeys. Some are pre-sales, some are post-sales, some are the buying process. What are the journeys that they're going through in their customer lives that we're trying to support? And so
But
again,
Nos, you've got to realize that this is why we're having the conversation.
yes.
Because I think for better or ill, we've both lived in contexts where we've been extremely frustrated by the way we are treating our customers and
Mm-hmm.
going, but if you just look beyond that, if you just connect the dots, if you just join these silos of the organization, we're not just talking about data rivers or data lakes, sorry, it was
Mm-hmm.
data lakes. We're talking about people lakes, we're talking about human lakes, we're talking about human experience lakes,
Preach,
where
sister.
the chances are that there are deep insights that different departments of an organization have about their customer. And it's like we were talking earlier about personas.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with personas is that you have to narrow down that scope so finely that you lose the nuance of what makes your customer human. And it's a similar problem
Mm-hmm.
with customer experience. Unless you're able to broaden the depth of understanding of what a customer does, it kind of falls flat. And that's why a lot of organizations, even if they do touch a customer experience, will do it from one department's perspective because it just gets far too complicated.
Mm. So I think that uh, it's a lot of things, interesting stuff there. So this year, depending on when you're listening to this recording, in the 2020 conference, we have Margot Bloomstein, who's going to be our keynote speaker, and she is a content strategist. And content strategy is another contentious term where people have different perspectives on it. And one of the reasons that we selected her as a keynote is she's going, okay, what are the messages which you're trying to convey as an organization? Regardless of channel, regardless of format, regardless of campaign, what are you trying to say to the world as a brand? Let's get that clear. Then we'll talk about how you package and ship it out on the various channels. And I think that it's about that zooming out. When we talk
Mm,
strategic,
mm.
there's a lot of, okay, let's come back and define the challenge, define what are we talking about, who are we really talking to, what problems are we really trying to solve. So there's all this zooming out. And so I'm huge on that. But it's uncomfortable for a lot of people because they want to zoom in. They want to get down into the nitty gritty and they want to go, okay, but today I've got a campaign to run and I want it to be frictionless. Um, but I think if we don't take those big picture step back moments, then we have a lot of issues. We have a lot of challenges. And your book
Oh gosh.
talks about leadership a lot. So I want to ask you, if you are going to go to omnichannel, what actions should leaders undertake or to help them prepare their teams or their businesses for this kind of way of working?
That's a really difficult question to answer because it's really the how long is a piece of string question.
Mm.
From a practicality perspective, you can't go wrong with understanding what your customer actually wants.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take the approach that Henry Ford did, which is, any color as long as it's black, or if I'd asked people what they'd wanted, they would have said a faster horse,
Mm-hmm.
then your customers can only take you so far. I think there has to be a combination of vision and execution. Now, I did a lot of work to write the book, the chapter on strategy. I rewrote the chapter on strategy many times because for me, I never understood the concept of strategy because it's been used so variously, like
Oh, yeah.
any of these terms. Everyone wants to define it. My strategy is I'm going to wear the blue shirt with a white tie. That's a strategy, apparently. But it has been. People use the term strategy for everything. So to answer your question, what should people be doing strategically or from a leadership perspective to use omni-channel across their organization? If we use the definition of omnichannel, that is, it is any way of reaching your customer and getting feedback from your customer. So we'll establish a baseline there, right? Yeah, we're agreed? That's the definition we're going to talk about from omnichannel. Then what a leader needs to do is to be able to have touch points across the organization that feed in their version of the truth for that customer experience in relation to how they can do that part of what they do better. And then it's the leader's job to be able to go, right, our strategy is to achieve X, whatever X is. How can the feedback that we're getting from each part of the organization in relation to the customer experience be tweaked in order to get to that X? Because the thing I learned about strategy while struggling to define it myself was that strategy is actually useless without execution. Because if you don't know where you're going, you can't get there. But if you don't know how you're going to get there, there's no point in saying we want to go there. Because they're two completely different things. So a lot of the advanced writers I read about talking about strategy were actually saying that you have to define your strategy in combination with the rest of your organization. I mean, that's tricky because the more people you add to a voice, it's like too many cooks spoil the broth. The louder it gets, the more confusion there is, the more subtle nuances about people arguing over terminology exactly like we're doing. So if we just look at a pure leadership perspective of how do we make sure that we're getting all of the channels, input from all of the channels, and we're giving output to all of the right channels, it's got to be about let's focus. Let's focus on that thing that we want to achieve, and let's focus on how every part of that organization can achieve that thing that we're focused, or can help us work towards that thing that we want to reach, doing the best of what they're doing in the best possible way that allows them to innovate sensibly and help us achieve that goal effectively, efficiently, promptly, and with hearts and minds in mind.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I've had a lovely conversation. I could talk to you for a whole afternoon. I'm pained to cut off this discussion, but I think we should probably wrap it up there. I hope we can have you back on the podcast, and I hope we can get you at some point physically over to the event, because that would be fantastic.
That would be great.
So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of our listeners who've tuned in today, and hope to see you online and in person in the future. Gina, it's been a pleasure, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you very much, Naz. And audience, keep on omni-channeling.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.